First, let me just extend my most heartfelt thank you to extending this invitation out here. Everybody that I've been in communications with today, but over the course of the last month or two, it's just been so generous, and I really appreciate it, I do. So today, I'm going to be talking about 5 lessons that I've learned in conducting racial equity work in specifically faculty evaluation. So I'd imagine it's no secret here that there are a number of different racial inequities across what I describe in my work as the faculty career continuum. We see that they originate and are standardized in graduate education and persist and continue once faculty are hired. We see racial inequities persist over the course and the lifetime of a faculty member's career, spanning into workloads and evaluation, promotion and tenure, and eventually, and unfortunately, oftentimes leads to a lack of retention and eventual departure from the university. So in my research, I'm extremely fixated on 3 enduring concepts: racial equity, faculty careers, and organizational change. And I believe that my research agenda addresses these in 3 primary ways. First, I work to identify the mechanisms that work to produce and reproduce racial inequities within the professoriate, be it practices, policies, what I've referred to as paradigms, or those kind of mental models that precede said practices, which can then inform policy and then goes on to become the culture, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And then developing tailored interventions to try to intervene in those ways, using some of the work in social psychology and organizational behavior. And then finally, because we know higher education is not just pick an intervention and then plop it down and then see if it works, we know that there has to be some level of attention to organizational change. How can we embed these interventions, these practices, policies, et cetera, into the fabric of our higher education institutions? And to this degree, I've done a number of work in different faculty career domain points, such as faculty hiring, which I'll be invoking some of today. Promotion and tenure, I'm not going to be talking too much about promotion and tenure, but my colleagues and I, we just published a report with American Council on Education, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, as well as retention too, so trying to understand why faculty leave and where they go after they leave. And so I thought it'd be nice to just give you all a little introduction to myself and how I got into the work, because this work is very much concerned with trying to elevate racially minoritized scholars in the academy, myself as one. Today, I'm going to talk about 5 different lessons that I've learned in conducting this work. The first is that we need deeper understandings of what constitutes equity and what isn't equity. We hear so many conversations across higher education, across different industries, across different sectors, of folks purporting to do equity work. We see that the NFL is going to end racism. I'm looking forward to when that happens. But, and there's all the, so I'll save a little more of my thoughts for when we talk about that, but our definitions of equity leads to our actions of equity. And so we need to be on the same page with what we mean by when we say equity and make sure that we're not collapsing it with fairness. I'll talk a little bit about tools over people, right? So there's this yearning for best practices across disciplines, across fields, and I find that in my work that in order to get the most out of our best practices, we need to be able to activate that through an attention to people and personnel and the context in which we live and work in. Then I'm going to animate that interest in focusing on people by discussing what I refer to as racial progress ideologies and implicit theories of change. We'll talk about why context matters now more than ever. And then we will return to the tools, because I always typically know that that's an interest of folks who are interested in bringing things back to the department, seeing what they can do, seeing how they can engender greater levels of racial equity within different evaluation contexts in the faculty career continuum. All right, so let's get started. Like I said, there's so many different definitions of equity out there, but there are 2 that I try to I consider my North Star when I think about racial equity within the professoriate and across higher education. First, I want to draw your attention to the far right. Dr. Estella Ben-Simon, professor at University of Southern California, she and her colleagues talk about how equity and equity-mindedness accepts that it's whiteness and not the achievement gap that produces and sustains racial inequality. It requires explicit change, explicit attention to structural inequality, and demands system-changing response. But I also like to pair this with Dr. Julie Passel's and her colleagues' definition of racial equity, and they describe it as a social justice imperative that prioritizes an institution's responsibility for transforming organizational practices, policies, and cultures to support equality of educational outcomes, in particular by race. And in bringing these different definitions together, I find that they help build a framework or a guiding lens for what we should consider most important when thinking about doing equity work and drawing a mirror up to ourselves and our departments and trying to interrogate the work that we're actually conducting. We need to identify what's being transformed. Is it simply the practices, or are we paying attention to broader things like policies, cultures, climates, and those paradigms? They're all important too. We have to make sure that we're taking an all of the above approach. What's the scale of transformation? Are we just trying to transform individuals, or are we trying to make it so that individuals can just better navigate systems, or are we changing those actual systems and those structures as well? But then also I want to call a little bit of attention to the nature of transformation. Is it simply deficit or diversity, or is it truly equity-minded? And what I mean by equity-minded is paying attention to race, rather than just acknowledging we have these inequities or disparities, tracing their source back to racism, sexism. We're being race conscious, and I'll complicate this later in the presentation, but there are contextual things that make this challenging, especially now more than ever. And so we have to take that into consideration. But we also need to be mindful that we need to support faculty to act, make sure that we view faculty as agentic leaders within their departments, curators of their institutions and their units, and ensuring accountability structures as well. So show of hands, who's familiar with this graphic? It's pretty common. So when I was first conducting my faculty hiring research, I would speak with faculty search committee members, and several of them provided this graphic as a sort of demonstration of what their EDI office provided them in terms of helping them understand how to evaluate candidates. So I won't spend too much time on this, but as you can see, in a quality perspective, not everybody can see the game if they get treated equally, whereas an equity perspective shows that when you give folks a tailored, customized sort of intervention, that then everybody can see the game. This graphic has since been transformed. When you take down the barrier, there's true liberation, right? But I'm simply showing this as a device to help us understand how different faculty are conceptualizing equity and how that informs our different practices. One woman in the social sciences believed that this graphic meant that every file got the same kind of review. You start in the same place, you work it, every file through the same way, each file gets a half an hour. So when she told me this, I was like, oh, that's like one way to interpret the graphic. That's kind of like not what I pulled out from it, but it's interesting because in so many ways, when we talk about equity, are we really getting at the most authentic kind of racial equity, or are we stopping just short of fairness? And I find in my work that oftentimes many of our interventions are designed with fairness in mind rather than actual racial equity. An equity perspective may look different. For this professor in the physical sciences, this meant that when they were looking at candidate files, especially from women candidates, maybe the letters for that person may have been downgraded because someone expects less of them. So that's an integrative perspective. I talk about in my work about how rather than just looking at candidate files as simply pieces of paper, putting them into context to try to understand the opportunity structures in which candidates are afforded and or lack thereof. So the faculty diversity discourse has been happening for some time, and as a result, there have been many positive interventions. I want to be clear that many of these interventions do have a role in engendering greater levels of equity within the faculty diversity discourse. So semi-structured interviews, that was a big advent at the time, making sure that we're asking everybody the same question. Those are important things. We shouldn't just be chumming it up with candidate A and then talking to candidate B, like, you know, all formally and stuff. Using the same criteria to evaluate candidates. That's also important. We can't just apply one set of criteria to one candidate and some to others. But an equity perspective takes these kinds of interventions and practices further by making sure that we're paying attention to the actual dynamics that impact racially minoritized candidates. And this is true in the job market, but you can also extend this lesson as well to faculty promotion and tenure as well. So asking equity-related questions during the interview and prioritizing that and assigning more weight to that in the evaluation process. and minimizing the emphasis on grant activity and counterbalancing as a result. So I want to talk a bit about that a little bit, because what's interesting is we have a decades worth of research that shows persistent, durable racial and gender inequities in how grants are distributed to scholars across disciplines, but primarily in the sciences. And yet we still use grantsmanship as a criteria item when evaluating candidates, and then we pretend as if the playing field is level. So what can we do about that, right? Because sometimes I'll get asked this and it'll be like, well, we can't not evaluate grant activity. Like, what can we realistically do? And I'll talk a little bit about that in lesson 5 as we talk about counterbalancing criteria in order to activate equity. But it's really a term that comes out of social psychology that essentially refers to, well, if we're going to have this thing that we know is an inequity, we have to try to counteract it or counterbalance it with perhaps item 1B, questions that get at equity contributions and DEI contributions within the hiring structure. So the first lesson is that I've learned from in doing this work is that when we get comfortable with fairness, we stop short of authentic racial equity. And that's not to say that fairness isn't an important requisite of equity, but it can't be the entire discourse. Second, in doing this work, I've realized that, again, oftentimes we really focus on the tools that help us conduct this work, and they're important, don't get me wrong. Things like rubrics, we just published a paper on rubrics and the legitimacy they afford, the sort of social construction of merit and talent. That's why I'm so happy to hear that y'all had Mary here, who's fantastic. She's truly leading some of the conversations on that. Inclusive job ads, diversity statements, we know that these things are important and they can provide us with a little more momentum, especially when we're dealing with colleagues who may disagree on certain sort of DEI contributions. However, in my work, I've been trying to be more intentional about how can we bring the field not just away from best practices, but how can we create a bigger, wider, more encompassing tent for all the variables that we know matter within the faculty diversity discourse. So the people actually using the tools, what are their racialized ideologies? What are their notions of progress of change? How much do they want faculty diversity and compared to their peers? Context, departmental context, institutional context, regional context. We know that these things matter as well. And so I argue in my work that oftentimes what I see when I go across the country and I talk with folks during various speaking engagements and such, is this sort of like best practiceification, right? Where it's as if we just had one more best practice that was out there, that we could just grab it and hold it. There has to be something that another institution is doing right, that we're doing wrong, rather than looking at the sort of constellation of people and context and trying to be more deliberate about the sort of calculus that we can use to understand the relationships between the people, the tools, and the context in which certain wins can be achieved and contexts in which certain wins may be more out of reach. So what does an investment in people look like? This is just one taste of it, but then I'll talk a little more about this in lesson 3. But I argue, based on the fact that we know, for instance, grantsmanship has embedded racial and gender biases in it, that we can't just stop short at implicit bias. We need some kind of training or some kind of artifact or some kind of process that shows faculty how their disciplines and their fields are evolving. Because when folks are hired, fields change, they're dynamic, and if we're not aware of these things in evaluating candidates, we can still use some of our status quo thinking that may be outdated, that doesn't take into account the current context in which racially minoritized scholars have to navigate to even end up on the general pool, onto the short list. So these are things that we need to consider. And so this is a short lesson, but I challenge folks to try to remember that it's not just some kind of practice that we don't have yet, or some kind of rubric that we need, or it's not calibrated enough. The rubric paper, which you can find online, was interesting. We initially submitted it to a journal, and it was a very sort of technocratic approach. It was very sort of like, this number of indicators and this number of items and indices would lead to X% level of greater faculty diversity. And the editors weren't interested in that because it's not just the fact that it's a rubric, but it's the fact that it confers legitimacy and standardization in ways that oftentimes make people feel like they're doing the right thing, but they can still be settling in racial inequities if those criteria are on the rubric. So it's not just about the rubric, it's about the kind of training and the constant maintenance we need to do as faculty leaders within our departments and our institutions, and making sure that we stay abreast of those updates. 3, so this is what I'm really excited about. I just spoke with Penn State about this topic alone. Racial progress, ideologies, and implicit theories of change. And I want to provide a little background for sort of how I came to this work. So initially when I was interested in faculty diversity, I was really focused on departments because that's where the action's happening. But I kind of realized at a certain point that all these departments are underneath the same institution, constrained by the same kind of institutional policies and procedures, and yet even when you compare departments with similar levels of racial and gender diversity, they reach such different outcomes. There has to be something happening, breaking down, dissolving at the departmental level that's helping shape and drive some of the action, right? And we know that departments are separated by their faculty, but they're also separated by their leaders as well. And I find that in this literature, we don't spend enough time thinking about the role of leaders and their own ideologies in driving change. And so I want to animate this a little bit, right? So faculty, or rather deans, department chairs, administrators, provosts, etc., are responsible for a lot. Not everything, but a lot. They help shape the search priorities, whether you go for an assistant or associate. They help shape the direction and the timing of the search, whether this search is going to happen this year or next. They conduct equity checks, either in the shortlist phase, in the general pool phase, in the finalist phase, and oftentimes they can serve as equity advocates. So I have this little maze, not that there's like a right and wrong decision, but that our choices have consequences. And oftentimes we don't think of the consequences as it relates to administrators, but we think about it solely as faculty members. And so I want to make sure that we're thinking about this. So that's sort of like one idea. I want us to hold this sort of in this corner while I bring over another idea, and I promise I'll make them come together. So who's familiar with this quote? Okay, so a lot of hands. I'm not surprised because this quote has been used so many times until the wheels fall off, really. And it's not even the whole quote, to be honest. So if you really kind of want to get into it, you Google, you can find the whole quote. But it's been used to sort of endorse ideals about the nature and progress of change. What's acceptable change? What are we willing to fight for? And what do we believe is the duration or the fight that we're in for? Some people believe that the arc is long, but because it's long and net linear, net positive, that will eventually get changed. But there's some who critique this phrase because, we're trying to make change in our folks' lifetime, right? Like, we're not just trying to make it 50 years from now, we're trying to do something today that can make actionable differences. So this phrase is contested, but it's interesting, right? Because it animates a whole literature base in social psychology related to racial progress ideologies. And it's essentially this belief that if you look at the large span of the US and racial politics and identity formation in the United States and abroad, there's a belief that we are net positive, linear. We're working towards or striving towards some kind of ultimate field in which we're going to eradicate racism, right? So that's sort of the idea, and there have been studies that have shown this. These studies also show that our racial progress ideologies directly relate to our perceptions of inequality. And so it's really interesting, if you ask white Americans what the black-white racial wealth gap is in today's terms and compare that to, say, 40 or 50 years ago, many white Americans will say that the gap has shrunk dramatically, despite the fact that it hasn't. Or if you ask them about ideologies related to college attendance and the progress we've made about that, you'll hear more about affirmative action rather than other kinds of advents that have contributed to how we diversify our colleges and universities. These are important because our perceptions of inequality help shape what policies we're willing to go to bat for and which ones we feel like are less important. And so I want us to hold these two ideas. One, that administrators matter and their sort of ideas about what's needed in their departments can help shape, accelerate, or diminish efforts towards faculty diversity. And this idea that we just as people have ideas about how close we are, how far away we are from faculty diversity, and what it takes to actually get there. So in thinking about these two things in tandem, I theorize that admin have their own sorts of implicit ideologies or racialized ideologies about what it's needed to activate faculty diversity within their departments and their units. And so theories of change are essentially these predictive relationships about if you do X, you'll get Y. So for instance, if I'm on Zoom and my dog's barking in the background, right? I have this idea about what will kind of like make him stop. Like I could give him a treat, I could walk him outside, but I have different ideas about what's going to drive some kind of change. There's an assumption in the heart of that. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Depending on your implicit theory of change and your context, you may see faculty diversity as incredibly important or less so. And I argue in some of the slides that I'll show you that come out of some of my qualitative studies that our perceptions of inequality driven by our implicit ideologies of change help inform what policies, practices, paradigms, cultures, norms, etc. we're willing to adopt and what we're willing to say maybe just out of reach or maybe our campus just isn't ready yet. So we think about this a lot in the work. So I conducted this was part of the larger sort of faculty hiring study. I interviewed many different deans, department chairs, equity advocates, et cetera, in EDI offices. And in speaking with them, 3 kind of buckets emerged as to where they were in their thinking about faculty diversity. There were incremental participants, pragmatic participants, and progressive participants. Do we have mics? Okay. Sometimes people like to read the quotes, so if anybody would like to read the quote, you can, or I can just read it. It really doesn't matter. Anybody? Who wants to read the incremental quote? Thanks.
Incrementalism. Good morning, everyone. We're bringing in diverse speakers, which in the long run may change some of the implicit biases in all of our heads. They take something as small as putting up posters of female scientists in the hallway. Does that ultimately affect the climate? I don't know. Does it change your slight bias on a faculty search? It's a stretch to say that, but it may be that 100 small things matter.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else want to tell me what they kind of pulled away from this quote? What are some things you're observing in this approach? You can either shout it out or ask for the mic.
Resignation.
Say more, I'm curious.
It seems sort of resigned to the way things are, that one has to move at a very deliberate or slow pace, and nothing else is possible.
Good point, yeah. And I want to be clear that it's not necessarily a one-to-one function of just who the individual is, right? But individuals in context, which we're going to talk a little bit about later. Anybody else? Anything that just drew your eye about this quote? Please. Oh, I think there's a hand. Yeah.
Seems almost like if you advertise it, maybe it'll happen by putting pictures up. That maybe that'll change people's behavior.
Yeah. It's very tepid in the approach. The proposed intervention, going back to the language of implicit theories of change, is very minimal. And there's an assumption here that it could ultimately change the climate. I don't know. There's a lot of qualifying words in this passage, and this was characteristic of many of the incremental participants. They talk about implicit biases rather than structural inequities, talking about the long run, something as small as putting up posters. So again, there's a lot of sort of like weird defeatism as it comes to this, related to this. But pragmatist participants, would anyone like to read this quote? Or I can. Sure. Yeah.
It's very modest. We don't even play the more radical game, pushing on merit, corrective justice, slavery. Don't want to go there. Not because it's unimportant, it's just that I'm a pragmatist. I'm just trying to say, look, you're not perfect. This is not your full-time job, or even full-time people don't actually know how to search that well. Let's just do it better. It's very modest, non-threatening intervention, which could create its own critiques, but it's done for a reason.
So what I found really interesting about this quote is that compared to the incremental participants, pragmatist leaders still acknowledge that there is potential faculty resistance and a desire for the status quo, but we're willing to put a little more skin in the game. And so in this passage, a leader's talking about the implicit bias training. They're saying how they don't want to go for anything too radical because they're worried of ostracizing certain faculty members who may be less of a sort of DEI proponent. But what's interesting about this is that these participants, at least compared to the incremental participants, were willing to do a little more to advocate, but this ultimately resulted in distinct practices that separated them from the incremental participants. And I'll read this last one, just so we can keep it moving. But this participant talks about, so if we're really gonna be effective, and I can't say this enough, we gotta keep our foot on the gas because we're swimming upstream, and if you don't, you'll just slide down. Best practices won't get us there without really exerted effort and because of that slope. When you see the slope of change of best practices, the slope is so level it's positive but slow. So what separated the participants weren't just the sort of paradigms that I talked about earlier as it relates to cultural transformation and change, but the practices that resulted from those paradigms. In fact, there's literature in science education that talks about how our conceptions of equality then lead us to adopting certain practices. So people who viewed equity as equality simply stuck to sort of like rote lecture and traditional sort of activities. But those who saw equity as equity did different things, and those who saw equity as justice did even more sort of active, engaged, participatory-based learning. And so what I argue in this work is that those sort of mental models or those paradigms then lead us to desiring certain practices over others. So for instance, incremental participants were only familiar with the initiatives already happening at the university. They didn't have much skin in the game. When asked about what their campus or what their department's doing, they would tell you, well, we have this postdoc program and that'll bring in some diversity, and we have this other thing. But they weren't doing much else in terms of what they were doing. Pragmatist participants did a little bit more, so while they were familiar with those interventions, they did a little more, right? So they managed people, they tried to track trends in the departments. They would say things like, well, y'all haven't hired, a faculty member of color in the last 3 years. Like, let's talk about this, like what's going on? They weren't afraid to get into some of those messier conversations. The progressive participant, and this is a cascading list to be clear, so everything that the pragmatists and the incrementalist participants were familiar with, progressive participants did even more. Such as doing personal initiatives, invoking collective responsibility, making it the work of the department, trying to say, hey, look, we're all in this together. We can all do something a little bit better. Let's see what we can do by working together. And I found that the faculty participants in the study who were sort of on the other end of these signals and messages really appreciated that collective responsibility. But what was interesting is that very few, one faculty participant talked about his perception of administration, and they said, they like to try to get us with carrots and sticks, in terms of carrots being an incentive, stick being a sort of like weird way to say like a punitive measure. Their observation was that there were a whole lot of carrots, target of opportunity hires, other kinds of interventions, but very few sticks. And so something that I do when I'm conducting workshops is that I ask a question like, what does it mean to try to subvert the sort of consensus culture of academia in which there are very few punitive measures to enforce things? Essentially, long wind of saying you can't force faculty to do certain things, right? I see some administrators nodding their head, they're like, yeah. So what does that mean, right? Like, what do punitive measures in this space look like, and are they even possible? So I think about this a lot in my work as well. The reason why I argue this matters, going back at that sort of the imagery I was trying to get y'all to think about why admin matters and why their implicit theories of change matter, is that taking one of the ways in which they matter as an example, so like an equity check. When you have a certain amount of diversity in the general pool in order to go on to the shortlist stage. That may be a practice here, though I'm not sure. Let's just say hypothetically you have like 3 different universes, right? You have a department chair who's more of an incrementalist, one that's pragmatist, one that's progressive. In the incrementalist sort of universe, the department chair looks at the general pool and they say, oh, okay, well you have 10% diversity, like, okay, like that's pretty good. The pragmatist says, no, we need a little bit more, 20% is gonna be even better. And the progressive person may say, well, it's really that 30% that's gonna take us to where we need to be. So this is just kind of like one sort of illustrative way that I think about why administrators' perceptions of progress, change, and the resultant practices needed to activate said change are important, because when we think about opportunity structures, there are many different ways in which our choices matter. And so we need to start thinking cumulatively about some of the choices that we make, not just in search committees, which are important, but as administrators and colleagues as well. And then the last concept I'll leave you with is, because I didn't want to forget this, is referred to as an Overton window, comes out of political science. Though I can't take credit for this, I saw it in Succession. Does anyone watch Succession? I don't know. I can't take credit. But for those who aren't familiar, it's essentially the sort of window of acceptable public policy that the public is willing to get behind. So 20 years ago, we weren't talking about things like reparations for Black Americans. We weren't talking as descriptively about redistribution of wealth. There are things that we think are acceptable, palatable, won't brush too much up against the status quo. We see those as easy solutions. And what I would like to challenge us today is to try to stretch our Overton window. Think what's acceptable within our departments, regardless of whether we may meet up or brush up against some challenges, essentially. So this lesson is that we gotta think about people. I argue that we need to measure different notions of racial progress and change in faculty evaluation reform and try to understand them. So practically this can look like requesting a sort of, Adriana Keyser at USC does a lot of thinking about how we can make our implicit theories of change more explicit by asking faculty to recall the intervention at play, recall the assumption, what's the context these things are working in, why do you believe this program or this initiative or lack thereof is believed to be able to make the change that it could. All right, so we have 2 more lessons and then I'm just dying to get to y'all's questions. So let's talk about context. So I argued a little earlier that context is really important because it's not just who we are and the racial progress ideologies that we have, but it's the context in which we're in. Some contexts are a little more accommodating, and as we've seen in the news, some other sort of regional contexts are less accommodating. So that just shapes our opportunities for what we can do. I'm going to talk about a few different kinds of contexts, and this is starting to get closer to some of the intervention and best practice work that I know folks are always interested in. So there's departmental context, the sort of departmental history of who's been hired and how they've been hired, the institutional context, which I find that most people are most familiar with, and the geographic context, which I argue in my work that we need to have a greater appreciation and recognition for. So departmental context, there are a number of different ways in which there are levers, pulleys, systems, gears within our departments that we can activate to engender greater levels of racial equity in a sort of organizational behavioral sense. I argue in my work that we need to think more deeply about hiring priorities, or that sort of initial system in which we determine the scope and direction of a faculty search, typically before the summer, before it happens in the fall. Oftentimes I observe that faculty diversity can get stalled because we're not thinking creatively and expansively about how diversity matters within the call itself. And so by that I mean, for example, over the course of the pandemic, we've seen a lot of different sort of like EDI searches, or a search for like Africana studies, or a search in Latinx studies, and that's one way to get about it. And I argue that's a pretty good way, though it has its challenges as well. Another way, though, is to consider the racial demography of the disciplines and use that as a compelling factor when trying to decide where to search, when to search, and why. So there are different ways that we can approach DEI within thinking about our hiring priorities. I find that faculty are notoriously risk-averse, and oftentimes that can detract us from the kinds of wins that we can exact if we were just a little more willing to take on certain risks. And so the risks that I find are most common within faculty search and selection and evaluation are there's no way they'll come, they're too good for us. I just recently published a paper, or it's due to come out soon, using nationally represented data that showed that faculty were no more likely to get the best offers as compared to their white colleagues, so that's a myth we really do have to retire. And there are other kinds of risks that I show in this work as well. And the third measure is something that's coming out of the University of Maryland, College Park. They're thinking about what it means to be ready. Does your department conduct itself in a way that's ready to take on greater levels of diversity? So I encourage folks to follow along with that third citation and follow along with Dawn Culpepper. She's a collaborator of mine. They're really on the front lines of that departmental readiness measure, and I think it's going to be really interesting when it comes out. And I'm not going to spend too much time here, but we know there are things at the institutional level that matter, such as equity advocates. A colleague of mine, Cynthia Villarreal at Northern Arizona University, looks at how institutional servingness, especially for Hispanic serving institutions, HBCUs, et cetera, how faculty internalize those signals and the importance of that designation into how they select faculty. In geographic context as well, so we need to be mindful of the things that are happening across the country. I had a fantastic conversation about this over dinner last night. It was part of the conversation. It was overall very fantastic. I was about to say it was not really fantastic because it's really kind of unfortunate what's going on, right? So like we know that DEI is under attack in Texas. We know that it's under attack in Florida. But we know that it's not just those popular cases, but we know that there are segments of that ideology across many different state governments. And I mean, this is it's a challenging time, especially when the courts are considering affirmative action. And so I'm concerned that there's going to be a bit of like disingenuous faulty thinking in trying to apply those logics to the faculty diversity discourse. Like, well, if we can't use affirmative action here, like who's to say we can't use it here, despite the two being governed by separate sets of laws and practices. So we need to think really carefully about the next 5 years, 10 years really, because I don't really see this issue going anywhere. And I think our officers are going to be tasked with doing even more now, given the fact that equity, CRT, other kinds of diversity-related advents are under attack. So this is just a quote from probably one of my more known papers, just talking about how searches are as much, if not more, about the department and the faculty than the candidates themselves, even though we like to purport it as a meritocracy. And I argue that this also extends into institutional and geographic contexts as well, but we need more empirical work to really test the boundaries of those variables. And finally, I want to leave y'all with some tools, because I do view they're important. It's part of an entire package when I think about it. And so by tools, I mean those things like rubrics, like DEI statements, like those things that we know matter. Typically, a really good tool will help us understand the criteria itself. What criteria are we applying to understand whether or not one candidate's better than another, right? So it's helping us assess research. It's helping us, I'm a wanderer when I speak. It's helping us understand teaching, contributions and service, those kinds of things. More recently, there have been kind of suggestions to think more critically about the weight of certain criteria. So how are you weighing teaching related to research? How are you weighing DEI contributions? Are we counterbalancing and counteracting those embedded racial inequities within our actual tools and our rubrics in a way that engender greater levels of equity? So weight is important. But I argue that order may be just as important, if not more so, and I want to provide a little illustration of what order means. Order is essentially the order in which you're evaluating criteria. So it's not just about 30% research, 30% teaching, but what happens if you evaluate the teaching first, before the research? What happens if you evaluate the DEI before the research? How does that shape the pool? And we have some emerging evidence about that from an evaluation project. So UCLA has this very interesting program called the Mentor Professor Program, essentially a recognition that the slope of change due to best practices is very slow, and we're going to need to do some more foundational organizational treatment in order to get at this issue. And so it attempts to do this by addressing the pool problem in two different ways. It brings together all the different departments within the life sciences division, but also it prioritizes what they refer to as the essential mentoring criterion, which is essentially the sort of DEI mechanism because it's in California context, right? There's certain considerations for diversity and evaluation. And so essentially contributions and mentoring work as that kind of mechanism to understand somebody's contributions to DEI. In a standard search, it would probably look something like this, where you first, like if you're doing a search in higher ed, you got to make sure everybody's a higher ed scholar, so that makes sense. And then once you make sure everybody's a higher ed scholar, you're looking at the research if you're at a research university, and you have various sort of factors and criteria that go into that, such as grantsmanship, productivity, number of first author publications, etc. And we all typically know how this goes. You evaluate awards, teaching, maybe DEI at the end if you're lucky. What's interesting about the mentor-professor search is that they use DEI as their initial winnowing criteria as opposed to research, and they found that the pool is still just as strong when you do this. However, it increases the diversity because, as this person says, it doesn't matter how award-winning or Nobel Prize-winning that they are. We're bringing somebody in to have an express focus on diversity, mentoring, making sure that the next generation of scientists conduct science in an equitable and transformative way. Then we can't just bring in and get caught up in just because somebody has all these awards, but we have to order and weigh these kinds of contributions if we say that they matter. So I'll give folks a little more time to read this because I thought it was a really interesting quote from our evaluation study. And we're trying to answer this question in other different ways too. So at the onset, Vic mentioned that I'm conducting this experimental vignette study, which is sort of similar to those sort of classic sociological studies in which you hold everything constant and you change the names. There's interesting research that shows that people may not be as responsive and sensitive to name changes, which is also super interesting. But we're trying to understand, does the order and presentation of DEI in promotion and tenure review matter? Does that matter? Because we find that minoritized scholars are doing this work in droves, but it's not mattering as much in their promotion and tenure as it should. So what are some things, some nudge interventions that we can do to increase the importance? Again, it's not just about weight, but it's about order. So order either in the CV. Is it all together and looks impressive, or is it sort of scattered throughout? These are some of the sort of behavioral nudges that we're trying to understand. So does the actual impact of the CV format matter for how DEI is weighed? That's one of the questions that we're trying to answer in this work. And does the order of a rubric nudge impact DEI, right? So in what order are the criteria assigned in that rubric? Playing around and being experimental with those things could lead to some lessons that I think oftentimes we're not really thinking of because we get the rubric that we used from last year and we're applying it to this year. And I get it because we're all busy, right? But I think, and this is, I guess, a lesson off the books, but one thing I've thought about is that this work is inherently, you gotta put something into it. You know, you get what you give, and if you're not willing to take some of those risks, then oftentimes you're gonna be on the end that you don't wanna be in. So I conclude this lesson by essentially just reminding folks that the ordering of evaluation criteria and activities is very important in a way that we currently haven't really talked about yet. So here's a summary. Here's what I believe are some important, and this is not an exhaustive list. I was tinkering with this on the plane, and I was thinking about like adding 2 more, and I was like, Damani, stop. Like, you only have so much time. But truly, I mean, I think about this all the time because it's so important to my work. And the lessons are going to change, right? Because this is a dynamic landscape. Faculty evaluation is constantly changing. People are trying to figure out how to better weigh community-engaged research. People are trying to figure out if DEI constitutes the sort of fourth stool when you think about research, teaching, and service, or should it be integrated across research, teaching, and service? Should a rubric reflect that? There's so much happening. It's a very dynamic, transformative, and evolving space, which makes it kind of challenging because I think sometimes people will bring me in and they're like, well, tell us the answer. And I'm like, there is no answer. And they don't really want to hear that. But there's progress. There's absolutely progress. So I'm 2 minutes over, but I think that's okay. This is a paper that my colleagues and I just recently published that I mentioned earlier, ACE. If you're interested in faculty evaluation reform, specifically in the promotion and tenure context and sort of what lessons we're learning across different universities, then I highly encourage you to look at this report. And then if you follow along on Twitter or on my website or whatever, you'll stay up to date with our results from the experimental vignette studies. We did another experimental paper that's currently in review right now, It was a sort of like hiring simulation, so this is the promotion and tenure equivalent of that simulation, so we're excited to share both results as they come out. Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. I enjoyed being with y'all.